All right, good morning. Welcome back to Economics 352. I'm your professor, as always, Todd Yarbrough. Now, what I want to do is I want to sort of set up what will be the next series of lectures. Now, depending upon your background in economics, you might consume these series of lectures differently than your classmates. If you have a strong background in microeconomics, if you've taken, for example, intermediate microeconomics, you will likely be able to skim through some of the material as I fairly meticulously, heavily review utility maximization. Now, why am I doing a microeconomic topic in a macroeconomics class? Well, without being too condescending about things, the feeling these days in economics is that macro perhaps might be more accurately described as aggregate micro. Now, there are, of course, most macroeconomists who would push back on this and not agree, but there is a greater influence, a greater purpose for what we refer to as micro foundations in macroeconomics. And so, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there were several macroeconomic events that pushed economists to rethink what were at the time sort of the traditional models and to come up with new or bring back perhaps even older ideas to try to help explain what it is that we saw around us. In this sort of strain of economic thought, there was a heavy emphasis on micro foundations, sort of placing macroeconomic conceptual ideas, but into the lens of microeconomic agents and making sure that when we think about the macroeconomy, we are also at all times thinking about microeconomic agents. Because as we know, at the end of the day, it is the microeconomic agents who generate the transactions that create the macroeconomic aggregates that we end up paying attention to. And so having a strong understanding, and I would say perhaps a strong reminder as to how economists think about that particular process is crucial. And what I'll do is I will tie what is a basic dynamic savings model, and I'll tie that directly into an initial section in which we develop the neoclassical income model and then move very quickly into considerations of monetary policy. The dynamic savings model sort of suggests that there is this lifetime consumption pattern that will be driven largely by interest rates. In fact, in the model, it ends up being just preferences, that is to say, what and how people want to consume, and then the interest rates that they face. And then what we'll do is we'll push that into this neoclassical income model, and it makes the conversation about monetary policy, specifically interest rate policy, much richer, and again keeps us honest and not thinking to sort of 30,000 feet. We got to drill down to the more granular level. Now, the other reason, of course, that we want to kind of develop some of these micro foundations is that we really want to understand consumption. So consumption ends up being, this extremely important part of the economic system. And so we want to not only kind of establish like what is consumption in the context of our particular models, but then what does that mean for macroeconomic dynamics? And then perhaps most importantly, what does that mean for policy, right? Because at the end of the day, intermediate macro is a lot of development of what should policymakers be doing to the economy. Now, sometimes that's what shouldn't they be doing, as is often the case. But what should they be doing, and what should they be paying attention to, right? What should they be, in a sense, worried about, if you will? Let's see. Oops, sorry there. There we go. So yeah, it's perhaps goes without saying that this is an important conversation and an important topic, but it can get lost a little bit in the weeds. And as we move through the course, I'm going to come back to, and you'll hear me reference the dynamic savings model and its place kind of in how we think about the broader economic system. So the other thing that I always want to do in this class is I want to make sure whatever we're talking about, we're tying it back to real world economic sort of data with an emphasis and a focus often on the U.S. economy, but we'll certainly look beyond the U.S. borders at times as well. So this is just personal consumption expenditures, PCE, for the United States over a certain amount of time. As was mentioned in the sort of introduction review video, like GDP, the line here means sort of not much to us. Although you'll notice that even in this kind of time plot, we can see the slopes of this line, which again is sort of what we care about. Let's go ahead and take this curve and let's do a little transformation. This ends up being perhaps one of the simple, practical things we might develop in this class, which is just how to use the St. Louis Fred website. So if I just go here to edit graph, I can change the units to what we typically care about, and that's percent change. You can drill down, look monthly. As you can see, the monthly is very, kind of hard to see outside of these sort of really big swings. It's amazing sometimes. I always get a little, I'm like a kid in a candy store with graphs, always have been since probably my intermediate macro class. And I just love the ability to tell stories or to see them. And it's amazing to see COVID. Like you can just see it in the data, right? I mean, we have multiple recessions. We have the so-called Great Recession, in fact, and it looks nothing like the sort of whipsaw behavior here. So it's just real quick, real interesting. I don't mean to be too giddy about it. It was obviously an awful event, and I don't want to diminish like the human suffering aspect of it at all. Graphically, it's just a very interesting thing to point out. So we're going to move this to annual percent change, just kind of more typical what we would look at. And you can sort of see, kind of over time, what does the sort of growth in personal consumption expenditures look like. And now, again, you can see, right, we have this really high kind of personal consumption expenditure in 1970 here. But this is, an inflationary kind of sort of outcome in a sense. Personal consumption expenditures were rising a lot in the 1970s, in part because of rising inflation. And then you can see here, for example, like the US economy was very strong in the mid to late 80s. So it certainly isn't the case that, for example, personal consumption expenditure was falling or growing less quickly. It was simply that, that's the effect of taking inflation out of the economy. And so you can just sort of see, kind of percent change over time. It's been fairly stable. It dips during recessions, but it's, if sort of look at this to an economist is a fairly remarkable, consistent amount of consumption in the economy. But we're always, of course, paying a lot of attention to consumption. You'll also sometimes hear, sort of consumer sentiment. Oops. Spell sentiment here. So University of Michigan publishes a consumer sentiment kind of graph that sort of kind of illustrates how people feel about their kind of consumption expenditures. It's a sort of a sense of like how people might feel about the economy. It's very noisy. People can be pushed to feel a lot of different things. So, this is a number that I pay attention to, but I wouldn't say that I put a lot of weight onto it. It's just kind of interesting. You can see that people recently, so if we just sort of drill down here to very recent, people have become fairly unhappy with the economy, kind of historical, sort of compared to the historical piece. If we go back 10 years, for example, we could see people were, generally very happy about the economy. And then kind of ever since COVID, people have not been happy. Now, that's interesting from a macro perspective because that has a lot to do with inflation. And it's not really just the actual inflation. That's going to be an important piece of how people feel about consumption. Because if prices are rising, people, and you go ask someone, these are surveys, and you go ask someone, how do you feel about your consumption? If prices are rising, you're not going to feel good about that, right? Your actual sort of human satisfaction is going to be lower. This was sort of interesting to me, kind of going back to the 2021-22 inflation event, where the economy was doing fine. The economy had really rebounded very quickly, as we've seen in the GDP numbers. But people didn't feel good about the economy. You could see this, right? I mean, the economy is by 2022 back to almost above where, again, we saw this in the first video, and yet people didn't feel good about it. It's because of inflation. That is very, very kind of a potent discussion that an economist likes to have, because that's a sentiment-driven thing, but also absolutely is going to have huge implications for the broader macroeconomy. When Jerome Powell or whoever is making is the Fed chair moving forward, is thinking about interest rate policy, they are thinking about things like, where do people think inflation is going to be, and what is that sort of expectation of inflation? What is that going to do to their consumption patterns? And of course, the other thing too is that when we think about what it does to people's consumption patterns, it sort of implicitly also involves a conversation about what are the other things other than consumption. Right? So what are people's investment patterns, of course? What are people's savings patterns? There's a lot of things that come from people's sentiment of the economy. And I might argue that in 2026, I've never seen as much focus, perhaps, amongst the general population as to, let's call it, the macroeconomic conditions. Whether or not that's for better or for worse is kind of an interesting question, but nonetheless. So now, just again, to sort of wrap up this sort of setup video, again, the idea is I want to sort of pose a kind of, we're going to talk about this, but let's talk a little bit about why we're talking about it and what are kind of the key themes of it. So again, if we go back and we just think about the expenditure model of GDP. Now, one of the things that we're going to do fairly early on is that we're probably going to think mostly in terms of closed economy. So we'll remove net exports at first. We'll bring net exports back. So don't worry, it's coming back. But we'll remove it at first because it makes the closed economy model is nice as a sort of setup and a foundational kind of precursor in a way. So what we're going to do is we're going to start and we're going to think a little bit about this consumption piece. And then in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to think about consumption intertemporally. Okay, so there we go. We're going to think about consumption here in terms of its intertemporal nature. Now, what does that mean? For our purposes, that means lifetime. So we're going to try to sort of engage in a conversation about how do people consume over their lifetime. And then because we're sort of looking at it from this intertemporal perspective, what it ends up sort of being a conversation about is, what do people do with the kind of trade-off between consumption and savings? That ends up being the main sort of thrust of the model. Again, it's a dynamic savings model. And so what we're interested in is thinking a little bit in a complex sense about the interplay between interest rates today and consumption today and in the future. And because we essentially assume that you either consume or you save, then this implicitly becomes a conversation also about the influence of interest rates on savings. Now, from this particular kind of model, we get some interesting ideas and concepts that have been very, very important to the development of economic thought. Perhaps chief among them, what we refer to as the permanent income hypothesis. So the permanent income hypothesis was an idea that was formalized, or I should say probably popularized by Milton Friedman. And it sort of argued that when people think about their consumption, they think about their consumption over their lifetime. Now, at first, people sort of think this is an odd idea, but then you sort of say, well, how do you explain debt early in life? How do you explain the fact that people spend more money than they have to buy things like cars and homes and other big purchases? And then over the course of their life, they're sort of paying off of that debt. Eventually, they're going to pay the car off. Eventually, they're going to pay the house off, right? So this is sort of an argument in favor of what we refer to as consumption smoothing. So one of the things I want to do with these sort of introductory videos is just give you some conceptual ideas to think about as you're going through kind of the basic theoretical framework. So consumption smoothing is a really interesting idea to economists, that we see that people don't consume exactly what their income is. That there are scenarios and situations in which we actually consume beyond our income, and there are situations where we consume sort of below our income. And then if we sort of just track kind of people over their lifetime and sort of take like an average, what we see is that people sort of smooth their consumption over their lifetime. In a sense, we can think about people sort of even smoothing their consumption over their income. And what I mean by that is, if we just think this is time, this is just money, then maybe someone kind of experiences a little bit of a cyclical kind of idea. It's generally going up, but it has its bumps in the road, right? You lose a job, you get a new job, you maybe start a new career, you go back to school, whatever it is. And of course, sometimes people do kind of cyclically go through these consumption patterns, but what people try to do is they tend to try to sort of smooth that consumption over and kind of end up consuming a relatively constant amount of things. So a constant amount of food, a constant amount of entertainment, so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this conversation that I definitely try to tie into this is, how do people's consumption and savings patterns change over their lifetime? Now, why does this matter? Well, this has huge policy implications for things like social safety nets. In particular, in the US, Social Security is a really important kind of policy debate, and sort of, let's call it a governmental problem, because there's a lot of concerns we have right now with the ability of the Social Security, let's call it trust fund, to remain solvent, especially as this most recent generation of retirees is huge compared to the non-retirees in the economy. And so it's very interesting to kind of think about the dynamics of consumption smoothing in that particular world, in which people are saving earlier in life, perhaps so as to have money later in life. But then if you have this sort of Social Security, social safety net, it's kind of interesting to think about what that might do to the spending and savings habits of economic agents in your economy. So again, just sort of things to kind of consider. There's also this interesting idea that we'll touch on a little bit more, called the life cycle hypothesis. This one sort of presents a more nuanced version of a similar idea to the permanent income hypothesis. But the life cycle hypothesis sort of talks about you having these different stages in your life, and that you're going to have different spending and consumption patterns depending upon the different parts of your life. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that this gets us into interesting conversations in the ballpark of what we refer to as the hockey stick effect. So the hockey stick effect is that in certain expenditure categories, we end up spending a lot more of money on those categories at certain points in life. In particular, we tend to think about this kind of later in life. So if we think about healthcare, for example, healthcare is this huge macroeconomic kind of thing. We'll talk about on kind of sort of subsurface level about healthcare throughout the semester. But the idea is that you spend less on healthcare, at least on average. The average person spends less on healthcare early in life, and then at the end of your life, you spend a lot of money on healthcare. So there's kind of this what we call the hockey stick effect. Now, that is very important in a world in which we're trying to develop a policy that kind of helps people stay solvent personally in their personal financial life. And of course, part of this conversation is something like Medicare. In the US, Medicare is a healthcare program that's specifically targeted for old, retirees who don't, get health insurance from a job anymore, so they need health insurance. And so Medicare is, again, supposed to be part of this social safety net, kind of a part of this sort of lifetime consumption idea. But Medicare, as it is today, represents a huge fiscal problem. We have created Medicare, and we've added to it and added to it and added to it. And it sort of nowadays represents almost pure debt. It kind of no longer is this well-funded program. Social Security is fairly funded. It could remain solvent if we just stopped sort of messing with it and using it for gimmicks. Medicare is itself a fairly unfunded policy at this point. You know, Medicare started out as kind of catastrophic care and has sort of ballooned. Now, you know, thoughts vary as to what exactly a universal system such as Medicare should look like. And I think that we should try to take care of people as much as possible. At the same time, if we're going to do that, we have to set up the fiscal funding mechanism to actually achieve that, and we haven't done that with Medicare. And so there's this interesting kind of interplay with all of these kind of consumption ideas, and then the kind of economic reality of how do we pay for very expensive healthcare when almost all of that in our lifetime is going to occur at the very end of our lives, when we are potentially at our worst financial kind of position to pay for those particular things. And there's just huge macroeconomic effects on this. I mentioned in the review video previous that almost all the job creation that we've seen in the U.S. economy over the last year or so has been in healthcare and social services, tied to healthcare and tied to this sort of hockey stick effect. We're seeing the hockey stick effect drive macroeconomic conditions, specifically in the labor market in the U.S. economy. And so I think over the long run, it's going to be very important for us to understand how these sort of consumption patterns emerge, how these consumption patterns could be affected by good policy, and what that means for macroeconomies and domestic policy agendas moving forward, I think is a very interesting conversation. So what I'm going to do is you're going to go through this sort of utility maximization piece. Again, if you've seen a lot of utility maximization, you might feel like you can skim through it. But definitely once we get to the dynamic savings model, pay a lot of attention to the development of that model. There's quite a bit of math going on there, but the central ideas, the key ideas are themselves pretty straightforward. As always, I'll have a condensed set of lecture notes on the dynamic savings model for you to consume, to kind of tie it all together and to make heads or tails of it. So anyway, until next time,